Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 12th presentation in the Power of Population Data Science webinar series. My name is Anne Greenwood. I'm the Education and Training Lead for Population Data BC, and it's my pleasure to introduce Jack Tang, who will be presenting on Sharing Linked Datasets for Research, Results from a Deliberative Public Engagement Event in British Columbia, Canada. By way of introduction, Jack is Project Manager for Using Personal Data for Research and Public Deliberation, and he helps manage public engagement at Population Data BC. He completed his doctorate degree at the University of British Columbia in Interdisciplinary Department of Resource Management and Environmental Studies, and he has a background in qualitative and quantitative research. So welcome, Jack, and thank you very much for presenting today. Just a reminder, everyone, before Jack begins, that you can use the chat function on the GoToWebinar panel to enter comments or questions during the presentation. I'll be monitoring the chat function and we'll queue up your questions for follow-up at the end of the presentation. So thanks again for joining us, and I'll pass the floor over to you, Jack.
Great, thanks so much, Anne. Thanks so much for the introduction, and welcome everybody. This talk is based on research that we did last April 2018, and which was recently published in the International Journal of Population Data, which I will talk about as well. What I'd like to talk about today is just kind of like generally the research itself, of course, but also some of the background, some of the reasoning of why we did this, and also the importance of kind of like this type of public engagement. To begin with, no conflicts, nothing especially to declare in terms of a conflict of interest. I'd like to acknowledge, of course, the other PIs and also the collaborators. So Michael Burgess, who's in UBC Okanagan, Kieran O'Doherty, who's in UBC Guelph, Colleen Bentley, who's actually the large group, who was a large group facilitator, and also the Deliberation participants, who generously gave their time, and they were reimbursed, of course, for that time, and yet they put in a whole lot of work for that as well. This project is also a CIHR funded grant. So this is just a general overview of the talk itself. So I'm just going to cover probably some general knowledge that you're familiar with, why, what the issues are, why do a public deliberation on data specifically, and also then moving on to just the reasonings around why we did our particular method. And our method is a little bit different than other methods that you may be familiar with. Some of the methods that you may have heard of would be things like citizens' juries, citizen initiative reviews, or even a public consultation. Public consultation is definitely not similar to this at all, but I'll explain why in a little bit. And then I will finally, after that, I will go into the recommendations that the participants came up with, and I'll explain a little bit about that, as well as show you an example of what was one of the recommendations that came up and how that kind of provides a little bit more context to the work itself. And then also just telling you what's next and what we're doing after this. The reasons for why I'm doing the public deliberation on data. So again, like this project was organized by Population Pop Data BC. Kim McGrail was the scientific director on this, and also I previously mentioned the research team. The title of the event was called "Using Data About You for Research: Who, How, and Why." And ultimately, the paper, the research, we were able to publish a paper on this very recently, I think just a couple of weeks ago, with International Journal of Population Data Science, and it's available online right now. Wanted to also clarify too is that one of the differences of our research was actually we were able to specifically talk about not just the question of whether or not it's okay to share data. So for example, for many other types of public consultations or public engagements, you may ask the question, are you, the public, okay with having your data shared? That's a very logical question and also a very important question. I think that's generated a lot of very important results. But in our case, we were lucky enough that we really focused on the data sharing system itself. And so what we wanted to get at was what the participants felt about what was important about the data sharing system. So the rules, the regulations, some of the expectations around how things should be run. And so I'll get into that as well. The main issue, why exactly do we want to talk about data? Of course, data about data and and the availability of data is increasing all the time. Every time we make a purchase, and there's more data that's produced. Every time we interact with the government agency, there's more data that's produced, and all of that can provide very interesting and unique information source to answer specific questions. So for our particular research, we looked at we mainly focused on administrative data, administrative governmental data. And so, for example, if you're going to one example of this is you go into the driver's license office, every time that you go there, a log is created. And that log is just put into this very large database. The use of that data is not intended for research. And so, which is why any kind of use that comes after using that particular data set that's created is called secondary use of data. And that secondary use of data can lead to very interesting research, not just using that data, but by combining that data with other data sets. So this is why we talked a lot about linked data sets. One example, going back again to the question of the example of the driver's license office, is I believe that one particular research program right now is looking at whether or not you can link up, say, the data set from the driver's license office and also just other that may have records on accidents and so on, and linking that with, say, pharmacare data. And so the question may be, are people, they might have very interesting questions on how to relate that data on prescription drug use and also driver's license records or something like that, and seeing whether or not there's any relationship to that. So that's one example of potential use of that. Now, of course, there's a lot of huge questions on whether or not how that should be used and who should use it and how it can happen. Now, for the largely most people from the public hear about the negative stories. So, for example, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica incidents that happened actually concurrently to when we actually did the public engagement in 2018. And I'll mention that as well, talk a little bit more about that as well. But one example that I wanted to point to was another data sharing initiative that happened in that was going on in the UK called Care.Data. And unfortunately, the public engagement and the public consultation process for that initiative, the Care.Data initiative, turned out to have a lot of issues. And as a result, the public, I don't believe they understood the program itself. Two, there were a lot of issues with what the program was planning to do, particularly with private corporation partners. And so it ended up being that there was enough of a backlash that it actually circumscribed the initiative itself. So that could be like the worst case scenario for a lot of these situations where you want to have linked data sets to be made available, especially for research and especially for a lot of the benefits that can come out of this kind of the potential of this kind of data. So one of the possible ways forward that PopData has been talking about a lot is, yes, you need to develop a secure data sharing system that is based on the 5 safes. And there are different examples of this. So safe people, safe projects, safe settings, safe data, safe output. So safe people would be, for example, ensuring that you have the properly credentialed researchers using the data, or safe settings, for example, would be you're working in a secure data secure area to look at the data, and the safe data itself is also data that is properly de-identified and or that doesn't have too much information that is not necessary for the researcher to use. So but that particular model of the 5 safes or other models that are out there are not necessarily developed in conjunction or as a result of consultation with the public. And so the idea here from PopData was how do we include the public input into this process. And so that's why we developed the data deliberation. We applied for a grant, and we successfully got it to set up a public deliberation on that specific question of data sharing and how to do it in a particularly trustworthy manner. So I wanted to get into, before I go into the details on the deliberation itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about just the background on why we do our approach on public deliberation, and why exactly, what is the reasoning, some of the philosophy, I guess, behind of this. The main question is, the main challenge to all of this is, how can a trustworthy policy be designed when there's so many different public interests out there, and that are diverse and very conflicting on very often? And how does policymaker or anyone like that account for all of that? How do they do that? And in many cases, it seems like a very daunting task. And so one common route is to say, okay, let's canvass people, or let's use a focus group, let's use public consultation. One of the issues around that is that the public consultation or focus groups tend to really, they're designed to get a gut reaction. And in fact, many of the policymakers that I talk to is that that's how they view a public consultation to be, is that I want to know what the people's first reaction to this, say, new policy will be. Will it cause a controversy? Will people be upset at this upon hearing this particular policy that we're proposing? That's not a very good way to get how people, what people actually think about a policy, because most of the time when people are hearing a policy, they don't just have a gut reaction. They also think about it. They also talk about it, or they read more. And so the question is, how do we access that particular type of the public's thoughts on a new policy or an engagement at all? And so just recognizing that, people, how do you integrate that fact that people do disagree, and they have different values, and they all want to talk about how to actually work through funds and through different interests, and how to balance conflicting values as well. So how to do that is we engage citizens, and we're engaging them not based on the expertise, but we're basing them, we're accessing their backgrounds just based on their life goals, life experience, and basically people who have knowledge in their own lives, they're experts in their own lives, and they are skilled at negotiating every day. So we're not just saying, hey, you need this set of knowledge. We're just assuming that they do have a number of these skill sets of how to discuss and how to evaluate situations, and also how to evaluate trade-offs and how to identify risks, and within a context that's important to them. And that's what's important, of course. And for them, they would be bringing knowledge about their own experience into the ideas of data sharing. So I wanted to also discuss a little bit about what exactly the group that we do tend to put together. It's technically termed a mini public, and the particular method that we use are public deliberations. And I want to clarify, though, that the public deliberation, the term, there is no official name to the method that we use, which is kind of unfortunate, because it makes it difficult to identify within the literature this particular method that we've used, which I'll describe, of course. But generally speaking, these types of public engagements that are deliberative in nature tend to put together what's called a mini public. Now, this group of mini public would be bringing together public, as I've described before, and they are, again, not experts, but the idea is that they are representative in a number of different ways of the public, and we want them to discuss and deliberate on the issues that we bring to them, and then as they discuss it, they may develop recommendations that are recorded, and and then they discuss, and then they talk about, and which can be then made into useful policy and also very legitimate policy recommendations. One important thing is that, which is also very different from like a focus group or public consultation, is that they're not pushed to come to a consensus. That is not the point. Consensus is not the point of a deliberation. The point of a deliberation, again, is to just get them to talk about an issue and to reason through it and to come up with the general recommendation, which may not be unanimously taken. And that's okay, because the disagreements are recorded, and that's also very important information, as I'll show you later on as well with a specific example. So this is, again, like one of the things that one of the important aspects of deliberations, and also the things that like we want to look for in the successful deliberation, is that not only are we giving the participants knowledge, but we're trying to enhance it in a way that they are able to deliberate it with their fellow participants. We want to encourage respectful listening, and we're not just having like a large group discussion. We also have small group discussions, and the purpose of the small group and the large group discussion is slightly different. For example, and I wanted to specify that, is that the large group, we tend to bring people together and to make larger recommendations because they're all together. Whereas in the small group, the idea is to just generate discussion and then to bring up as much diversity of opinions as possible. And then that's why during that period, it's more something like maybe like a brainstorming process that they do in the small group, and then they go into the large group, and they talk again together to come up with these larger conclusions. And again, like I really wanted to highlight the persistent disagreements thing. The persistent disagreements, or the lack of consensus, is an enormously informative and important aspect of the process. Not only does it provides information about what will potentially be an issue in the larger public, but it also provides insights on what people are finding important. What are the crucial issues that they as a public, or this group of participants in mini public, are unable to address, or could be addressed later on in another deliberation. There is another process, a final process, which is just to ratify the group conclusions. That I'll explain in a little bit, but basically it's a process whereby people will have a second opportunity to look at the recommendations that they've come up with and vote on them again, decide on them again, and then they'll conclude on that. And there are specific reasons for that, which I will clarify as well. Other things that are important, of course, when you're running a deliberation, is that you do want to make sure that you have a policy receptor for the deliberation. In our case, we were quite lucky. We were working with with the Ministry of Health, who were attendants and observers of the event, as well as the Integrated Data Division, who also attended the event, and they and also other members of the government were part of the planning of the process, in that we consulted them on what they felt were important questions and what were some of the issues, and they helped vet some of the questions, some of the information materials, not the questions, but some of the information materials that we provided for accuracy. And they had no, just to clarify, they had no veto or anything like that. They couldn't say no, you can't share this information. But they were there mainly to make sure the process was clear, and also at some point there was going to be a very clear policy receptor to the results of the event. I did want to talk a little bit about the recruitment of the event, just because that tends to be something that people are interested in. This type of event is usually this type of event that we call a public deliberation. Usually brings together about 25 to about 30 people, and the question of course, is like, how do you recruit these people? Not only how do you recruit these people, how do you make sure that it's representative or a meaningful mini public? And so the number of different types of ways to select for diversity, and then I'm indicating three of them here on the slide. Is so one of them is, say, the egalitarian one is that, so for example, say you have say you wanted to consult the Christians of the world on a particular topic. You might want to have two representatives from each denomination, so two Protestants, two Catholics, and so on. Whereas, say you wanted to do representative diversity, what you might want to do in that case is you choose the proportional amounts of the Christian denominations out there. So, assuming that there's 60% of Catholics in the world, then you'd want to have 60% of the participants be Catholic. Now, the last one is normic, and the normic ways of selecting diversity is essentially you account for the egalitarian, a mix of the egalitarian representative, and then would you correct for the diversity by identifying specific groups that tend not to be heard or are difficult to recruit. So in our particular case, that normic, we did use normic recruitment, and we identified the two particular groups that were difficult to recruit, which were First Nations and also the younger group, so the 18 to 24 age group. That we identified as being important to recruit, and we recognize that they might have potentially very different opinions on data than the rest of the population. So to clarify again, like it's not like we did not use representative or egalitarian methods to recruit for the participants, but we did use kind of a mix of the two methods, and then that's something that I can talk about a little bit more. It's also we discussed a little bit about that inside the paper as well. So the deliberation itself. The deliberation itself happened last April 2018, and we had recruited actually about 33. I say 25 here, but like what ended up happening was that from the 33 people, we ended up having melt off. So basically that means is that we had some people just not be able to show up because of life circumstances. Some people, one guy ended up having a splitting headache, couldn't show up. And unfortunately, it meant that some of the people, some of the groups that we were really trying to retain, couldn't retain. We couldn't stay on, and so, for example, a couple of First Nations representatives ended up leaving, and then, or we ended up just having people just leaving the event just because they lost interest. So that does happen, and we were happy that we managed to retain 25 people, and that is a good number that does go on. That is a good number that we've managed to retain for other events as well. For the event itself, during the event, one of the main things that is quite different from deliberations from, say, public consultations and focus groups, again, is that instead of just bringing the participants in and just showing them, very brief topic and asking their reactions to it, the participants in this type of engagement involves quite a bit of information giving and also training. So there was development of an information booklet that had a great deal of information on the data sharing system in BC, as well as the issues in general around data. And they had a whole half day on the first day of the deliberation on and hearing talks from speakers that we chose to talk about different aspects of the data sharing system that we identified as having some issues. So, for example, we invited a data steward, a researcher, a privacy advocate, a person living with disability, and a First Nations member to talk. And the data steward was mainly talking about issues around the data sharing system. So, for example, they were talking about how difficult it was to sometimes come to an agreement with another data steward if they were going to be needing to share the linked data sets. So what he was reporting was challenges around standards between data stewards and how that, as a result, leads to delays in providing data to researchers. The researcher talked about how the value of some of the linked data sets, and in particular, they identified, they were talking about the opioid crisis going on in Canada. For those I'm not familiar, who are not in Canada right now, the opioid crisis is an incredibly challenging and tragic issue going on right now in BC, in particular, where there's a very, very large number of people who are dying from overdoses. And so there's been kind of like a very strong push to try to figure out how to resolve this. The privacy advocate talked about some of the issues around, of course, privacy, as well as some of her concerns around just data sharing as well. Now, I do want to clarify, though, that the privacy advocate wasn't saying no to research. She was mainly just saying some of the concerns that she'd be watching for if data sharing would be made more accessible than she felt she was comfortable with. The last two people who talked were two people who we thought would represent voices from the community who were strongly impacted by the usage of data. And so one person who was a part of Collegiate talked about her experience with data sharing and talking about some challenges she experienced when the information that she was trying to give to her primary care facilitator was not being shared to other nurses or other doctors who she may be seeing. And so she was a very strong advocate for more ease of data sharing because it impacts her life, and especially because she's a heavy user of the medical system. And then the last person was very interesting, was also a member of the Indigenous community who was talking about the past relationship of Indigenous communities with data usage in general, and oftentimes where people where First Nations or these communities felt as if they were in many ways exploited by the researchers, and then the benefits didn't go back to them. And so there are a lot of questions from her part just about ensuring that the data usage is used respectfully and not used to continue on stereotypes of the Indigenous community. So those are five speakers that they spoke to, and they also spoke together during a final 1 hour panel with when all the participants could ask all of them different questions. So this here again is just a summary of the information that we provided to them. So again, there is, as I was trying to point out in my long description of the speakers and what they talked about, was that quite a bit of information is provided, and a lot of information is very in depth, and then the participants also do have an opportunity to continue asking more questions throughout the process. However, the experts and also the government observers were not allowed to interact with the participants unless the participants were specifically asking them a question. And the reason for that is that we wanted the participants to feel free to deliberate on their own level and without feeling intimidated by someone who might have more information than they do. So there is just some research on people feeling as if they would defer naturally to the expert, and fear. We didn't want that to happen. So to complement the speakers, a lot of the things that we did talk about were things like the timelines and the procedures that need to be taken to go through the data sharing process, and how long it could and can take when there are issues, and when there are issues around just the rules or or disagreeing data stewards, which is something that we did touch on a couple of times, and also that the participants mentioned on as well, as I talk about. The event itself, how do we set this up? So it's quite a long process, as you can imagine. So I don't know if I clarified this, but the event itself is actually 4 days long over 2 weekends, so 2 non-consecutive weekends. And so it's quite a long period of time and full days too. So it's quite a long period of time for the participants to be involved in this type of event. And so it takes a lot of time for us to develop the agenda and also the information. So 4 months prior, we start talking about the information in the booklet, and that does take quite a while to prepare. 2 months prior, we start recruiting the participants, and then 2 weeks prior to the event, we mail out the information to the participants. And then 1 week before that, we have the final deliberation question. Now, to be clear, the deliberation questions that the participants talk about during the event, we were developing those throughout the entire period of time. So it's not like we only developed the deliberation questions a week beforehand. I wanted to also comment on this. This particular method is a little different in the aspect of developing an information booklet compared to other methods. So my understanding is that for citizens juries, there isn't necessarily a large information booklet that's prepared for the participants, and for example, another method that is very similar to citizens juries, which is citizens initiative review. They actually don't have a booklet at all. For the participants, almost all the information is provided at those types of events during the event itself. So that's just one difference, and I think that it is. I don't think it's a major difference, but just to clarify that there are different ways of doing this. This is the booklet, and it was about 20 pages long, and then it was very user-friendly. We had a lot of people kind of go through it just to make sure that it's accessible. On the standard is just get it to grade 8 level, reading level. The deliberations, as I mentioned, occurred in large and small groups. And this is a picture here of the large group facilitation. The Colleen is the person that you see facilitating right now, and the participants are sitting in a U-shaped arrangement. And the reason for that is so that the participants can all see each other, and so that they're able to make a connection with them. And this way they can all talk. And then, as you can see from the microphones, everything was transcribed and recorded. The schedule itself, I wanted to just show very briefly, just to highlight again how much preparation there is involved. So the day one, the green box highlights almost the preparation that comes up in terms of information giving. So this whole half day of just information giving. And then after that, that's when they start breaking out into either small groups or large groups. The small group discussion is we have them again doing the brainstorming process. And then they break out into groups of about 7 or 8 people, depending on how many people are available. And then after they've talked to the small group discussions, they reconvene into the large groups. And then it's during those periods of time that they start being able to develop recommendations. So how are recommendations actually formed? That's a very good. That's probably a question that many people ask. Is that as the conversations or the discussions that the participants are having, as they sort of coalesce into one way or another, the large group facilitators, so Colleen in this case, would say, "Hey, this sounds like you guys are coming up with a recommendation? How about we develop a recommendation? To begin, usually what we do is we help provide some of the wording, but for all other recommendations later on, it's only the participants who develop the wording. So all the recommendations that were developed, just want to emphasize, they're all strictly the participants' words and their development. They also do a lot of correction of the recommendation, and so there's quite a bit of discussion around use of specific words or addition of specific suggestions, and so that process can take a little while, and it's a process that we call wordsmithing, and it can be, to be frank, a little bit long to watch, but it is an important process, and it's something that ultimately results in recommendation that the participants feel that they own. After they make the recommendation, and this can be like on the first day, second day, third day, or fourth day, they vote on the recommendation, and that vote is recorded. And then, depending on how much time we have, the large group facilitator goes around and asks for general reasons on why they supported it or not. And then, so when they do vote, it's not just yes or no, it's yes, no, or abstain. And the abstain also provides a lot of information as well, because sometimes the abstain is not so much because they disagree with the recommendation, but because they just disagreed with the wording. And so knowing that is also something that that's why the transcript analysis is very useful in that particular case, to look at teasing out like what people were actually supporting and in what ways and what they were actually concerned about. The deliberations themselves, questions, was the meat of the event, and this is what one question at a time that the participants talked about during their small group sessions, and then brought back to the large group to help develop recommendations with. So first question was, what is important information to consider when improving access to and use of linked data? Second question was, when is it justified to grant access to linked data, and what measures are important to reduce risks? Third question was, wasn't actually a question, but it was scenarios. So the team developed 3 plausible data sharing scenarios, and then asked the participants to discuss them and apply trade-offs, and then about them. So, for example, there was one example where a researcher was working with a private corporation, and there was some issues around privacy, and then they would compare that to another scenario where there was a professor working and requesting a large set of data that could be potentially have sensitive information. So they needed to, in working those scenarios, they identified potential challenges, and that resulted in recommendations as well. And then finally, the fourth question was, what process would make assessment of the risks and benefits from the use of linked data trustworthy? I should emphasize that even though they were asked to deliberate on those particular questions at those particular times, they had recommendations that came up about all of those questions all throughout. So it really depended on what the participants were talking about. So they weren't constrained in any way. We tried to encourage them. The large group facilitator tried to encourage them to keep on top of one topic. But if they wanted to talk about, if they wanted to return to a previous topic, they did, and then they made recommendations about that. So some of the results that we developed were about 19 recommendations, and so and then they fell into 4 different categories. One of the categories was governance of linked data sets. So how should linked data sets be shared, and how should the rules go around that? Who should govern them? Then they talked about the review process and the security around linked data sets. And so that, of course, that unsurprising was a very large concern for the participants. And then they talked about responsibilities of the data stewards and researchers. And so They specifically identified some of the things that data stewards should do, as well as researchers should do so for the process to go on. And then they finally talk about public involvement and what that should be. I want to also talk about a little bit, just very quickly, about how the results, the outputs from this event is different from other different types of public engagements. Some public engagements, types of public engagements, result only in a participant written statement, and so there may not be votes. There may not be separate separate recommendations, but there might be, for example, one long statement, and then talking about what they agreed on, and but nothing very specific. But sometimes they do. There's another example would be a citizen initiative review, where they come up with not so much recommendations or even votes. They come up with a list of pros and cons. However, all of these methods do engage the participants in similar ways. So if that's something that you're interested in, it's a very complex and very diverse field when it comes to different types and methods of public engagement. And I think that trying to figure out which one is appropriate for which times, and also the benefits and pros and cons of each particular type, is still something that's being studied. Here's an example of one of the recommendations. So the recommendation itself was there should be a committee or governing body with authority to do a number of different types of things. So one was provide insights, oversight, or to an investigation over the data sharing process itself, apply penalties, develop policies, or intervene when data stewards agree, develop and operate an appeals process. This particular recommendation was the result of a lot of concerns by the participants who wanted some kind of standardization. They were talking a lot about how the data stewards disagreed, and they thought that was inefficient. So the conclusion, or one suggestion, was to have a committee that kind of regulates all the process that goes on. Now, the voting result was very interesting because they did not agree on it. So only 8 people agreed on for this recommendation. 7 people disagreed, and then 8 people abstained. Now, what's very useful inside the research that we provided, and also the analysis that came up, was that in looking at the transcripts, the participants weren't actually opposed to the committee itself. They weren't opposed to the idea of something that provides this type of adjudication process between data stewards. That was not what they had an issue with. What they had issues with was actually problems around trust of a committee itself. So for a lot of the participants, they didn't trust the idea that a committee that may be put in that might be neutral. They were afraid of things like, say, political co-option or something like that. So that's something that we tease apart inside results, and then that's something that I wanted to point out that provides quite a bit more texture and also nuance to the results. Whereas if you were only looking at the votes themselves, you would just assume that the participants did not want a committee at all, which is not the case. So in general, as with many of the previous public engagements on this type of topic, the participants were very supportive for research to be done. They really they really saw the value of research, and they felt that the access to data should be facilitated as much as possible. And so they talked a lot about efficiency. They talked a lot about trying to improve the process and the standardization of the deciding mechanism. They also were concerned, of course, of commercial entities. They made a couple of recommendations on not approving, not wanting private corporations to be involved. And they also had concerns around just like authority and data, as I was trying to point out with concerns around committee. But I do want to emphasize that they also did not want efficiency to come at the expense of privacy. And so that's something that was coming up in the transcripts as well. And with regards also to the collaborations between commercial entities, so like private corporations like Facebook. What was interesting about that was that initially the participants were 100% not wanting any kind of commercial entities. But as they talked more about the potential benefits of research and also just the resources that private companies had, on the final day, they voted again on their recommendation. And in fact, there ended up not being consensus at all on the involvement of commercial entities. And many people had changed their opinions on just flat out banning them based on the fact that they recognized that there could be some benefits to involving the commercial entities. The question was how, and that's not something that we were able to get into in this particular deliberation. The review process, the security and review process, they of course identified that the scientific review process is very important. They talked a lot about how data protection. They wanted to emphasize that there should be very stringent rules around data protection, and they did also emphasize about talking about how the communities, vulnerable communities that are being researched should be accounted for in some particular way. A lot of the recommendations actually in this, when it came to this process, were recommending existing processes, like for example, ethics reviews and so on. And we don't view that as we consider that that repetition of existing processes as being supportive of current procedures and so on. One thing that we did note was that they did not suggest to have the data stewards monitor the science. So that's a very important distinction that we felt was quite important. Was that they felt that there was a very important distinction made between the roles of a data steward and the roles of the researchers, and they felt that the data stewards, their main role should be to look at the data access only. That their purview should be more circumscribed to just the data access part, as opposed to the research and also the potential impact of the research. And so the participants were commenting on how the research there already was a process to vet the research, and they cited the peer review process and so on. This responsibility of data stewards and researchers, the participants really heavily highlighted the issues, some of the challenges between the data stewards not having standardized trainings or standardized policies or practice. They really wanted to either some form of credentialing or some form of general training to allow the data stewards to be all on the same page. They did want to have the linked data sets to be like more formally governed. And so at the moment, the linked data they aren't like, there aren't very clear rules on how linked data sets should be governed. That's something that they were hoping to have. And then, of course, they repeated some suggestions on having that the researchers should always have very specific training on data privacy and security. Public involvement, they didn't get into a huge amount. They did talk about transparency, that being very important. They did not really specify what that transparency looked like. They had quite a bit of discussions on a website, potentially showing the different kinds of different data access concurrently that were going on. But there were a lot of discussions around whether or not showing that data or showing that information was useful. And some participants worried that putting that type of information online may lead to panic or kind of misinterpretation. Other participants were very adamant that like that type of access was very important on principle, and that person was actually a journalist. But there was still quite a bit of discussions on that, and I don't think that I think in general they do, of course, they did want public involvement in some capacity. I think that they just were not able to really get to anything very firm at that point. And that was the fourth day too, and so the participants were quite tired. After 4 days of deliberations, I think that there's quite a bit of work involved in that. Generally speaking, the participants supported research, of course. They did talk about governance and then trustworthy governance. They wanted trustworthy governance that was reliable and standardized and efficient. They really recognize the critical role that data stewards play, and so they really wanted them to be well trained. And yes, they did expect transparency, even though they didn't quite understand, quite get to what that would mean. So some of this information, some of the consequences of this, how does that actually impact some specific policies? And I like to talk a little bit about how that could potentially impact the de-identified data. So the question, of course, is what does de-identified data mean? And that currently is my understanding is that like many people disagree on what it actually is. So how much is de-identified? There's no strict definition of what de-identified, a data set that is de-identified actually is. So some people are very, very strict. They remove a lot of information that can sometimes be useful. But since privacy and research are both wanted by the participants and also the public, how would that influence the definition of de-identified data? So that is a question that still needs to be resolved. But one important thing to point out is that it's not the participants do not only want privacy. I think that that's something that a lot of the policymakers tend to err towards. They're concerned about potential privacy breach and the impact that will be on them and potentially like on the institution. And so they err on the side of like high de-identified data. However, in many cases that could result in not very useful linked data sets. So that's the question that still needs to be resolved. What comes next? Well, we are currently developing a second data deliberation into fall of 2019. And the topic of that probably might have to do with relationship between researchers and private corporation data sets, but we're not quite sure yet. That's something we're still working on with our policy partners. There's also the new Canadian National Data Platform that Pop Data is a part of that does include public engagement and Indigenous community engagement. So that's something that we may be tying in as well. That's about it. Some of the references here. If you want me to pass along any of the references, I'd be more than happy to give it to you. And also, of course, this talk as well. Yeah, I'd be definitely happy to answer some questions. Hopefully, I wasn't too rambling.
Thanks, Jack, very much for your excellent presentation. Lots of good information. The floor is open. While we're waiting for questions, Jack, just a question in general, in terms of the representatives and expert speakers that you had that were part of the deliberation, how do you think they felt about the outcomes of what they saw during the sessions? Were they impressed, or did they have more questions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In many cases, when we do have policymakers attend these events, they're always impressed by the fact that the participants have such a high depth of discussions. And I think that for many policymakers, they're surprised that the participants don't just end up disintegrating into acrimony. So, but the participants gave really reasoned and well thought out recommendations, and that's something that impressed them quite a bit. For the actual recommendations, in many cases they were very pleased by them because they were supporting some of the policies that they're hoping to institute themselves. And so hearing that from the participants gave them more legitimacy to go ahead and institute what they were planning.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Do you think that there were some comments that came out of the deliberation or proposals that you were not expecting?
Yeah, that's a good question. What we were, speaking to some of what we weren't expecting. We weren't. We were actually, I should say, what we were expecting was that the participants would be really focused on the private corporation because the Facebook Cambridge Analytica issue was happening right around then. And so we were worried that they would just get fixated on that. But we were surprised when the participants very, very quickly said, okay, yeah, that's research purposes was very different than private corporation. And then they were able to very willing to focus just on the research purposes. And so we were a little bit surprised by that. We were prepared to kind of like have quite a bit of talk, answer questions around that. But again, even though we hoped that they would focus on research uses, as I mentioned before, they did end up producing recommendations on the private corporations in the end. It was only one though, but yeah. Anyway.
Great, thank you. And I do have a question from Mika from UBC. I was perhaps surprised by a focus on conflict between data stewards. Did this come up as part of the presentations on the first day? Just wondering how this arose as an issue.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that did come up. That did come up during the first day, and I think I may be making the conflict sound a little bit more dramatic than it sounds. It's more like there were disagreements. We identified disagreements. We told the participants about disagreements that can sometimes happen between the data stewards around the interpretation of privacy legislation. And that was inside the information booklets. And then, but that was only one of many of the other of the systemic things that we were talking about that they heard. But that was one topic that the data steward during their talk to the participants referred to as well. And so that was one of the challenges that the participants heard and also latched onto, even though there were a number of other things that they heard as well.
Great, thanks for that clarification. So I don't know if there's any other questions that people might have. We're getting close to time now. If there are questions that you think of after this session, please feel free to email us. We'd be happy to follow up with any additional questions that you might have. And I know that I'm sure Jack would be willing to reply to those. Jack, anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
No, thank you a lot for your time, and I hope I was very clear. And but yeah, otherwise, just ask away.
Great. Thanks again, Jack, for participating and being part of our webinar. Really appreciate your time and sharing the information and all the resources. So we hope to hear from you again soon after maybe your next one.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks everyone for attending, and bye for now.